As a manager, I know that you know that communication is so important, but it's not just communication the way that we often think of it. Every day, whether you are fully remote or you're working 5 days in the office with all your teammates, you are communicating through virtual modalities, which make it tough to stay connected and get your message across effectively. So in this episode, I spoke with Andrew Brodsky, CEO of Ping Group and an award-winning professor at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication, and was named one of Poets&Quants' World's 40 Best Business School Professors Under 40. Andrew specializes in workplace technology, communication, and productivity, and today he is going to share his science-backed strategies for communicating effectively through virtual modalities. Now, if you think you know how virtual communication works, I challenge you to think again. Here is my conversation with Andrew. But first, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and other tips for managers every week. Thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew. I'm super excited to talk about virtual communications because, one, I love talking about meetings. So virtual meetings are like, I'm so excited to talk about meetings. But this is going to be like a much more expansive conversation. And one of the things that I tell my clients is meetings are only one of your tools in your toolbox, right? And we have all these different ways of communicating, and so many of them happen virtually. And now you're going to come on and help us make sure that our meetings are good and all of our virtual communications are good. So thanks for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk more about meetings. I don't know too many people who are so excited about meetings, but I think it'll be fun talking about that and all our different choices that we have when we approach communication.
Let's start with just how do you define virtual communications? Like what counts as virtual and what isn't?
So these days, pretty much most of our ways of communicating, aside from in-person and written communication, now qualifies virtual. So it's any communication that happens via electronic means. So having video meetings like this, cameras off meetings, telephone calls are now virtual because pretty much they're all happening via our smartphones and voice over IP, emails, instant messages, text messages, all this fits right in there.
So pretty much everything except for meeting physically in person with someone.
Effectively, yeah, or writing a letter, good old-fashioned one.
People still do that?
Occasionally.
You know, one of the things I really like that you talked about in your book was like, even if you're in an office with your colleagues, you're still communicating virtually all the time. Can you speak to that? Because I want to make sure people really understand how important this topic is, regardless of whether you work remotely or you work in person or you're in a hybrid mode or whatever.
That's one of the main reasons I wrote this book now is that I've seen so many conversations happening. Is remote work good? Is remote work bad? And the thing all these conversations are missing is that we're all virtual communicators, regardless of where you work. The old way of being in the office before all the recent communication technology was if you had a question, you'd go over to your coworker's cubicle or office and just ask it. Now, in most cases, people send an instant message. And that's for better and worse. It's for better in many ways because you're not interrupting whatever they're doing. It's kind of seen now as presumptuous to go interrupt someone, whatever they're doing, just to ask your question that may not be time urgent. Now we have a way to more casually ask our coworkers questions without interrupting their focus time or their work with instant message. Obviously, there's potential downsides here because even when you have in-person work and people are only sitting a few feet away from each other, they're still using technology as one of the primary, if not the primary means of interacting with one another.
I can see how that impacts relationships and the kind of environment that we're in, but also how much more important it is to know how to use these various tools correctly, because we're all dealing with virtual communication overwhelm all the time. Can you talk a little bit about the different modes of virtual communication and what you think they're really good for and or what they're really not so good for?
I wish I could say there was like one best mode of communication, but then I'd have a very short book. It really depends on a lot of factors on what's going to be the best mode and what's going to be a different one. The way I talk about it in the book is I think about, many researchers do, communication modes vary in a variety of dimensions, but the two main ones generally that are considered is something called cue variety, which is basically how similar is the amount of cues or nonverbal behavior to face-to-face interactions. Can you see the other person? Can you hear them? And then the other one is synchronicity, which is how real time is the interaction. So are we having real time? Is it delayed? And the thing about synchronicity that's interesting is that even little differences matter. So video calls, for instance, they're basically synchronous, but they're not as synchronous as in-person interactions are. And this little bit of lag because of data transfer speeds, as many may have noticed, can make conversations slightly more awkward because research shows that there's this minuscule lag and it can result in problems with conversation turn taking. So there might be awkward silences, or you might be interrupting each other a little bit more on video calls than you would in person. So even when something seems like it might be the same, there's still differences that matter. And understanding these dimensions is the first step in understanding, okay, what mode is best in a given interaction.
That makes a lot of sense, and I never really thought about it, but our brains are so sensitive that, yeah, those little tiny things that are happening that we don't even perceive can have a big impact. I'm wondering if you can give us an example of a communication and like what would happen if it was in person that would work well? What would happen if it was like a virtual call? What would happen if it was sent as an email? How are each of those different modes going to like help or hinder that communication?
So let me pick one particular outcome. So in the book, I talk about how different modes are better for different goals. But let's say in a given interaction, you care about being seen as authentic. And authenticity is a big buzzword. There's a lot of people saying, oh, you should always be authentic leadership. And that's really, really key. And in the book, I talk about that there are two different kinds of authenticity. There's this true authenticity, which is we actually are feeling what we're expressing. We're actually happy for a coworker and we're congratulating them. We're actually happy for a customer, or we actually feel bad on behalf of a customer and we can sympathize with them well. Then there's a second type of authenticity, which researchers often refer to as surface acting. This is the idea that there are many situations where you need to display different emotions in interactions, whether it's work or otherwise, that you may not be feeling. So there's this idea of service with a smile. But maybe you just had a really bad morning and you're just not in a good mood. It's not a good idea to be nasty to customers because you're in a bad mood. Or like, let's just say your coworker got a promotion that you feel like you deserved, but you really like your coworker, but you're really upset. To not congratulate them and say, I'm upset you got this promotion is a quick way to ruin that relationship. So that's the idea of surface acting. Now, bringing this back to communication technology. I did a set of research studies with managers, with negotiators, and actually a set of international schools in Vietnam with parents and teachers to examine which modes are best for being authentic. And if you think about it with teachers, these are teachers in private schools who are paid based to have students in the class. And oftentimes they need to have conversations with parents about a student who's failing, who's a behavioral problem. And they need to pretend like this kid is great. And they have to have this smile on their face. And that's an example of surface acting. But the findings. When you're truly authentic, the richest mode you can do is best. So whether it's in person or video is best because it lets your authenticity shine through. And it's seen as the highest effort. But the question comes, okay, well, let's just say I'm not actually feeling what I need to feel. Maybe I'm not happy, I'm displaying happiness. Maybe I'm not feeling bad because something great happened in my day, so I can't express sympathy. What mode is best? Well, what I found in my studies is that those people who needed to engage in this kind of surface acting used email. But that was one of the worst choices because email is seen as so low effort, or text messaging or instant messaging, because it's so easy to fake it. It just seems like you don't care. So what I found was that there was a sweet spot, which is basically audio interactions were the best when you need to engage in this surface acting, because audio seems as much more effortful and authentic than email, but you don't have to worry about your underlying cues leaking through as they do in face-to-face or video. So when we're interacting face-to-face in video and you're not actually happy for that coworker or customer, it sometimes sneaks through and they can detect it. So there's a grimace or a hand motion or you look away. And the nice thing about telephone or cameras off calls is that it hides all that while seeming still really authentic, whereas text-based isn't. So that's a quick, or not so quick, example of here where authenticity plays out in really interesting ways in terms of achieving our desired outcomes.
I love this so much. And I think we have totally underestimated the importance of voice messaging and voice phone calls, like cameras off calls, because it has seemed like, oh, it's so much better to just do a camera because then we get all this other information. Or it's not worth the trying to sync up and we should just send it as a text message. But actually voice is so, so powerful. So I'm really, really glad to hear that there's actually a particular use that is really well suited for. And I think we should all be sending more voicemails and making voice messages. Actually, let's go back to this synchronicity piece of this too, because are there times when we should be striving for a more synchronous communication method versus times we're actually having or working more asynchronously and giving space and not worrying about how long it takes to respond is actually better for us?
Definitely. And there's lots of times where one's better and the other's better. So I'll often see companies taking these extreme stances where some are like, we're getting rid of all meetings altogether. And then I know. And then there are others that say like, we hate email. Let's not ever use email or anything. The problem is that both extremes are really bad. So if you're saying get rid of meetings, and many people agree with this because they have hours and hours of wasted time in meetings every week. So it's maybe a good start. But the problem is that email can be really, or instant messaging can be really, really inefficient for a lot of things. So for example, this conversation we're having right now, I'm fairly talkative. You've got a number of questions from me. Each one's, I don't know, I'm giving like 5-paragraph answers. If you had emailed me these and I had to write up my answers to each one, it would take me days. You've got lots of back and forth, or it's a situation where you'd be concerned about perfecting things and making them look exactly right. Where email really, really, or instant messaging would take so much longer than just having a real-time meeting. But on the other side of that, there's a lot of meetings that are a waste of time. So if it's just you're trying to relay simple information to a large group of people, having a 50-person meeting just to relay something that could have been put in email is going to waste everyone's time. When you think about the amount of man hours that went into that one meeting, it's really obscene for the most part. So thinking about when it comes to one of the examples of meeting versus text is, okay, is there going to be a lot of back and forth? Because if there is, we want to do that synchronous. I'm not going to want to ask follow-up questions because I know it might take you hours or day to respond, and it's going to slow everything down over email. So it's not just it slows down, it ends up with less information. But if you're going to be relaying something simple, there's not a lot of back and forth going on, then really text-based communication can be a lot more efficient.
There are 6 different reasons why you should have a meeting and 1 reason why you shouldn't have a meeting. And you shouldn't have a meeting if all you're trying to do is convey some straightforward information. That's like the one reason. And the answer to the big question, could this meeting have been an email? If it was just to convey information, yes. Do you find the same?
I think there are other reasons not to have a meeting. So for instance, research on brainstorming. So if you think about brainstorming process, the idea is we want to get as many creative ideas as we can. But when you do that synchronously in real time, there's a few issues. One, only one person can talk at a time. So there's an immediate productivity loss as opposed to everyone doing it simultaneously. The second thing is people are kind of often afraid of being more unique because everyone's staring at them. And the last thing is once someone says an idea in a brainstorming session, everyone's mind kind of anchors to that idea, and it's hard to have more divergent thinking and ideas. So research shows, for example, that brainstorming, the initial stages of it at least, are better when it's done separately and virtually because it comes up with more ideas, more creative ideas. People feel more free. There's a few others too. So like going back to that idea of feeling more free, research on workplace interpersonal biases show that if people feel restricted in some way, so the example that's in this research where they do the meta-analysis, so a study of studies of negotiation, they found that, unsurprisingly, to have good negotiation outcomes, in many cases, you need to be more competitive or aggressive. But when you think about gender roles, who is supposed to be more aggressive and competitive, men or women? Most of us realize that's associated with men, right? If we picture a tough competition, we're probably mostly picturing men. And research shows that women, as a result, feel less comfortable negotiating. But when they do so virtually, the gender differences disappear, basically. Because the idea is we're behind a screen, so we no longer feel like we have to act as much like others expect us in certain ways. So it can be freeing in many ways to interact less synchronously, or at least less visually. That said, there are, of course, the downsides to that. That freedom results sometimes in people saying negative things they might not in person to the other person. So it can cut both ways, definitely.
I have to go back to this brainstorming thing because this is like one of my new things that I really love talking about, which is that brainstorming shouldn't happen just live in a meeting, and that it can happen live in a meeting, but we have all these great virtual tools to help us put all the ideas in anonymously to get them all thinking at the same time. So we're really like optimizing and not just letting one person share at a time. I have a whole separate episode about brainstorming that I'd like everyone should just go listen to. There's something magical when you get people together that happens, whether in person or virtually, that I find doesn't always happen when you are only working asynchronously. So it's really about putting together your right toolbox, right? Like, do you have any thoughts on like, how do we have the right set of communication tools so that we're not overwhelming ourselves with everything has to be a meeting, or nothing can be in a meeting, it only can be an email, or we only use chat GPT for this and Slack for that. And like, we just can't, what do we do about all that?
Whenever I read a self-improvement book or business book, I personally like having a framework because there's usually like so many recommendations and I have trouble remembering them. So I did that in my book. So in my book, Ping, I made the Ping framework for ease of memory. So I tie all the recommendations of the book into 4 overarching strategies. So the first is perspective taking. One of the issues that happens when we're interacting virtually is that we often become more self-focused. So when you're interacting in person, the person standing in front of you, they're taking up your whole visual field. It's hard to forget that they are there. But when we're interacting virtually, we're often just staring at text on a screen, or even if it's a video call, it's just a small square of the person we're interacting with. So it's easier to forget that they're there. It's easier to forget their perspective. So taking a moment to think about, okay, what mode would this person prefer? How might this person interpret the message differently than I am from my perspective can be incredibly useful. Next is the I initiative on Ping framework. So the idea here is think about what's missing from a given mode and how can you add it back. So an example of this is that there's research on negotiating via instant message and email, and it shows that it often doesn't go as well as in person. The reason being is that there's no small talk, or as the authors call it, schmoozing. So what they did is they had some groups have a quick phone call just to schmooze for a couple minutes before they did the negotiation over text. And those groups built a lot more trust and did a lot better in their negotiation than those who didn't. So thinking about what can I add back in here, what might be missing is key. Next, the N, nonverbal. So understanding all the different nonverbal cues that go on with a given mode is really vital. So we often don't realize how much we're sending. So for text-based communication, things that can relay information or emotion is typos can relay emotion. We got exclamation marks, we got emojis, time of day your message is sent. There's so many different things that relay emotion that we don't, or information that we don't even realize we're doing. And lastly is G for goals. And this gets to the idea that there's just not one mode to rule them all, basically. So sometimes certain ones are better, certain times others are better. So let's say videos on versus videos off meetings. Back to the topic of meetings, which is better? Well, it depends on your goal. If your goal is to show you're engaged or to build trust, then videos on can be good because it makes it clear, hey, they're looking at me, or at least creates illusion that they are. But the other thing too is we trust those that we're familiar with. If you don't know what someone looks like, if you don't know their mannerisms, you don't feel like you can trust them because you don't know them. So that video on provides a lot of information. But on the other side, there's research on Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue, which shows that having your video on is exhausting. We spend a good chunk of the calls just staring at ourselves on our screen, and it's really stressful, especially in high-stakes interactions, and it can be draining. So having the video off can reduce stress and burnout, potentially allowing you better focus. The takeaway here is maybe early in new relationships and when showing engagement is important, turn that video on. But for existing groups where you already have built impressions, you already have trust, then videos off might be better for everyone. But again, kind of brings it together in that Ping framework of how I usually recommend people approach their choice in communication and then how they use that communication.
This is super, super helpful. And one of the things you said about using like emojis or like all caps or like how emotion gets displayed in text. My daughter, who's a teenager, said to me, Mom, when you put periods in your text messages, I think you're yelling at me. And I was like, I'm using proper grammar. How am I yelling at you? But there's definitely something that gets lost in translation in text. And it's one thing to be like, okay, you're a 15-year-old kid, like I'm going to ignore that. But I feel like it's a different thing in the workplace where We have multiple generations. We're all trying to communicate. We have different styles. Are there norms that we should be embracing around showing emotion in our texts, communications? Like, should we be using emoji to try? Like, is that okay? Not okay? What about like other ways? How many exclamation points are allowed? Like, what else can we do to support good text-based communications?
I get the emoji question all the time. I think it's probably one of the most common ones that I'm always getting from students and other people. And the answer to that is with emojis, there's a lot of it depends. So in some cases, it can make you seem warmer. In other cases, it can make you seem less competent. The recommendation that I generally have also stems from research, which is engage in something called language mimicry. So this is the idea that if someone else is using emojis, use them too. If they're using exclamation marks, you use them too. If they're using certain business jargon, use that as well. The idea is you take your cues from the other person. And the reason why this strategy tends to be so effective is we trust others who are similar to us. So when someone communicates like us, we feel like we can trust them. And the other thing is that we all feel like we communicate the right way. So when someone communicates like us, we feel like, oh, they're a good communicator too. I want to put a note here, like, don't go overboard with this. There's research that shows that if you engage in like intense mimicry, to not really much of a surprise, like Simon says, it's going to seem weird. Everyone's going to have different opinions on emojis, exclamation marks, whether they're professional, whether they're useful. So one of the best things you could do is look at how the other person's communicating and take your cues from what they're doing and then communicate in a somewhat similar way.
What about like asking our boss, or like, should we as a team be setting norms around this? Like, is it something that we should think about in the bigger context of our work? And are there things that are okay to do, not just in text, but even with other forms of communication that are okay for us internally, but we shouldn't be doing it with our customers or with our vendors or with outside stakeholders?
So one of the conversations I generally recommend most to have amongst teams and organizations is to talk about especially the norms of communication response times. So there's some really interesting studies on what's called the email urgency bias, which basically is the concept that if someone sends me an email, I expect they want a response pretty quickly, but they don't really. So for instance, you send me an email and I'm like, oh, this is an important person, podcast host. They were going to want me to respond immediately. But on your side, you're like, I don't care if he doesn't respond for a couple of days. And this really creates a lot of issues because we all get really stressed that we have to respond quickly. We're checking our phones all the time, even at home with families. And this ambiguity is really problematic. So what I recommend is making the implicit more explicit when it comes to communication. Actually having a conversation amongst your team saying, okay, how quickly should we respond to emails? Let's say maybe a day. For instant messaging or Slack, how quickly should we respond? Let's say 2 hours. That way, if you're in a meeting or you're deep in a task, you don't interrupt it. If there's an emergency, what should we do? If something really urgent, should we do text message? Should we put like an urgent tag or something? How can we reach you in an emergency? And these things are really great because it allows you more time to disconnect, decreases unnecessary stress just due to this ambiguity of how should we be communicating. And then you're also not on the other side left wondering, this person didn't respond to my email in 6 hours, or I'm in a relationship and they didn't respond to my text in an hour. Like, do they hate me? The fact that you've already had those conversations beforehand about response expectations doesn't leave you wondering on the recipient side as well.
What a stress reliever to know what those time like norms are around time. And also it sounds like different modes have different timelines and also maybe different purposes. And that can be really clarifying because sometimes I think there's questions of like, should I send this as a Slack message or should I send this as an email? Any thoughts on like how we differentiate between those two forms besides the time response component?
Yeah, and I think that's going to differ very much from team to team, group to group, age to age. That's why it's important to have these conversations. For people who've been in the workforce longer, email was the primary means of communicating everything. So they use it both for more informal things and more formal things. Whereas for younger people in the workforce, they came in when there was instant messaging, text messaging, and email feels extremely formal as the only thing you ever use it for. So it's not that there's necessarily one right or wrong way to use these things, but coming to a consensus is one of the best things that you could generally do in this so that you're all on the same page and realizing we may all be coming from different perspectives, but let's figure out what works for all of us so no one's guessing anything and we're not in this situation of, I don't know, and we're all offending each other without even realizing we are in the process.
Okay, what about video messaging? I feel like have been some efforts to try to like use different voice messaging or video messaging apps to try to replace some of the text based, which is both great for people. That's not like their go-to method of communication. They'd much prefer to like talk it out, and for increasing some of those other pieces you mentioned around the tone of voice and the kind of expressiveness and the relationship side of things. What are your thoughts on like, why haven't we embraced this? Or are we in the early days of embracing it and you think it's still coming?
I see a lot of this too, especially there's number of asynchronous video email platforms now. I work with one company, BombBomb, that does this heavily in the real estate space. So a lot of particularly salespeople and marketers are often using these more asynchronous video tools to show, hey, I'm sending you something personalized. Here's a video of me talking to you. The reason why, now I haven't seen clear research on why these things haven't picked up, but I think it's a similar reason why you see many people get annoyed about voicemails, in many cases, voice notes. Unless you have something that transcribes it, it can be a bit annoying, A, to create, and then B, to receive. So let's just go from the creation side. If I'm writing an email and I look it over at the end, I'm like, I messed up one word, it takes you about 1 second to retype that word. If you've recorded a 3-minute video and you messed up one word, you have to do the whole thing over again. It's a little bit less rehearsable. Like, it's hard to edit here. And on the recipient side, the nice thing about text is that you can read through it very quickly. Often, most of us can read quicker than someone speaks, for instance. And if you need to reference a certain sentence again in the future, it's easy to have that sentence. But in a video or voice note, if it's somewhere in the middle of the thing, you're kind of skipping around. So there's more inconvenience and hassle on both sides. That's not to say that these things don't serve a purpose. If you're really trying to show excitement for someone, calling them and leaving them a voicemail where they can hear your excitement is definitely going to do better than just sending them a text message saying, great job, exclamation mark. So there are these benefits there, but I think it's the hassle factor, if I had to make a guess, of why these things really haven't picked up as much as many would have predicted they have.
So interesting. All right, well, now I'm going to have to go on a search to find the perfect voice and video messaging app that also transcribes and makes it very, very easy and convenient, because I love talking and I just want to like record everything instead of having to type it out. But we have to wrap up. So Andrew, tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss.
Yeah, so my great manager, I would have to say, is Adam Grant. I had the pleasure of taking the first class he ever taught at Wharton before he became famous. And at the time I was a student and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my future. And he saw kind of some potential in me. And he was the one who introduced me to the idea of doing a PhD and set me down on my career path, and then acted as an advisor for me throughout my studies. And one of the best things he did for me was set very clear and stretch goals for me, but making sure to provide me with the advice, the mentorship, the resources along the way so that I could reach them.
Oh, I love that. I love when people help push us. Amazing. And where can people learn more about you and get a copy of your book?
Sure. So my book, Ping: The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication, is available wherever books are sold. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, where I probably post the most. Andrew Brodsky, I'm sure you can find me there. But yeah, it was great getting to talk with you today.
Well, thank you so much again for joining me. This was super fun, and I feel like I will become a better communicator now that I have even more understanding of how to use meetings and how to use other tools.
It was great getting to have this call with you. Thanks.